This podcast is made possible by the listener members of Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's May 18th, 2026. On this day in 1916, nearly a year before the United States entered into World War I, a Tennessee man fighting in that conflict became the first American pilot to shoot down another plane. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee with historical context from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. To be fair, Kiffin Rockwell is claimed by a few states. As a child, he lived in South Carolina for a while. He went to school in North Carolina, then on to the Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee University. And after that, he worked in an Atlanta advertising firm. But he was born in Newport, Tennessee. And there was a degree of competition to claim him because he was considered an international hero back in the day by the French and by Americans who thought our nation should get involved in World War I. When the war began in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared the U.S. would remain neutral. A year later, when a German U-boat sank a British ocean liner called the Lusitania, things changed. That ship was full of civilians. More than 1,000 people died, including more than 100 Americans. People were outraged. Public opinion started to turn towards our nation getting involved. And in 1916, Wilson still maintained diplomatic relations with Germany, but there was a real debate going on about whether that was the right approach. So in the midst of all that, the news that there was an American flying ace was electrifying. But how did a guy from the American South end up flying fighter planes in a foreign war that America hadn't yet joined? Well, Kiffin Rockwell and his brother Paul were true believers that freedom was on the line in World War I. They decided pretty much as soon as war broke out that they should be involved. By August of 1914, they were on a ship headed for Europe, eager to do their part. Before the month was up, they were members of the French Foreign Legion. They were fighting in the trenches about a month after that. Now, we know a lot about his actions because Rockwell was a prolific letter writer. After he and his brother were split up, they wrote letters that didn't sugarcoat things. After all, they were fellow soldiers in the same war. They spoke frankly to each other about what was going on. And in his letters to Paul, Rockwell spoke of being under heavy mental strain. He complained that being in the infantry during trench warfare meant that he was always in danger, but never really made much of a difference. At one point, he said, quote, "I believe it possible to go through the war without ever taking part in the kind of fighting we imagined we would do." He successfully petitioned to be transferred into a unit of the regular French army instead of the Foreign Legion. He liked that a lot better, but he was wounded a few months in, taking a bullet to the leg. The convalescence was clearly frustrating to him. His thoughts turned for a while to figuring out how to transfer over to the U.S. Army if and when our country joined the fight. But then in September of 1915, almost a year after he first put on a French uniform, Rockwell wrote to his mother that things had changed for him substantially. He had snagged a spot as a student pilot. He described it as moving from the lowest branch of service to the highest. He said, "It is the most interesting thing I've ever done, and is the life of a gentleman, and I am surrounded by gentlemen." He became a founding member of the Escadrille Lafayette, a unit of Americans serving with the French Air Service. Military flight was brand new at the time. I mean, in a lot of ways, flight was still new. Cockpits were still open to the air. At first, they didn't have weapons integrated into the planes. The pilots carried rifles and pistols to fire by hand at enemy pilots until someone figured out how to install fixed machine guns. Well, a month after the Escadrille Lafayette finished training and went into service, Rockwell was the first of its members to shoot down an enemy. Rockwell wrote his brother that he was patrolling over the trenches when his plane's motor started to act up a little. He turned around to head back to land when he spotted a German plane below him, clearly over the line and in French territory. He dove towards the enemy, then saw the other plane's gun aim in his direction. He took a hit before he could open fire, and he could only get off a few shots before needing to swerve to avoid a midair collision. But his aim was better. They landed a negligible blow to his plane. He hit and killed both the pilot and the gunner of the German plane. The story was reported by newspapers all over France and the United States. Rockwell was lauded as a hero. Kiffin Rockwell went on to shoot down 3 more planes. But in September 1916, about a year after joining the Air Service, Luck ran the other way. That time, a German gunner got him. His plane was shot down, and he died. He didn't see the day that his home country joined the fight. He wasn't there with the rest of the Escadrille Lafayette when the unit as a whole was given over to the United States military, setting important groundwork for the later development of the Air Force. But he was not forgotten either. His uniform coat is in the collection of the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, and his name is inscribed in the Paris Panthéon, in a space reserved for people who offered heroic service to the French nation. In just a few minutes, preserving another important and complicated piece of Tennessee's military history, one that takes up an entire Nashville hilltop. That's coming up after the newscast.
We know that local government isn't the only part of your life.
Like the mayor, I know that city government isn't the only thing you're concerned with.
We are still struggling to find affordable housing.
Particularly with this bus stop.
That's one of the unique challenges with my business.
I'm WPLN's Metro reporter Cynthia Abrams. I'm working to break down topics like transit, housing, and local government to make sure that when you are thinking about Metro, you're getting the full story. Follow my latest stories at WPLN.org.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. 4 buses of Tennesseans traveled to Alabama this Saturday to protest a recent Supreme Court ruling that weakened voting protections for minorities. The decision hollowed out laws designed to prevent racial discrimination and redistricting, and Tennessee was the first state to redraw maps after the ruling. Republican lawmakers voted to carve the majority-black Memphis into 3 reliably red districts. Memphis was the state's only Democratic congressional district. Hundreds gathered in Selma and Montgomery for the All Roads That Lead to the South protest. Equity Alliance, which is a black-led grassroots organization in Tennessee, was among the crowd. Its founder, Tequila Johnson, says that redistricting efforts in Tennessee are part of a broader Southern strategy to weaken the black vote. Lawmakers are working with nonprofit and community leaders to get inactive Tennessee voters to the polls before they are dropped from the rolls. Under state law, voters who don't cast a ballot for up to 4 years are labeled inactive. If the voter takes no action for another 2 federal election cycles, or 4 years, they are removed from the voter rolls. Channel 2 reports that State Representative Justin Pearson helped launch Activate TN in April. The initiative's purpose is to inform active voters of their status and encourage them to vote in the August primaries so they won't be purged. Tennessee has long struggled with voter turnout, having the worst voter turnout in the country in 2022. There are currently 740,000 inactive voters in the state. The attempt to ban auto racing at the Nashville Fairgrounds and instead enshrine affordable housing as a priority there has cleared a hurdle. The Metro Charter Revision Commission certified a petition on Friday. This isn't a vote for or against raising or housing, says Commissioner Jim Murphy.
Our role is to determine whether it meets the criteria. The only ones that are really relevant here, in my opinion, are whether it's confusing and misleading, whether the title and the charter amendment are consistent.
The Commission's decision is not a clear indicator of what will happen. Petitioners cleared this same hurdle earlier this year. Then a court challenge got the effort thrown out. And now it's back with clarified language. People who want affordable housing at the racetrack still have a ways to go. The petition could be challenged again in court. If it makes it through litigation, petitioners would need to collect signatures from 10% of Nashville voters. Only then would the decision go onto a ballot for all voters to get a final say on whether racing or affordable housing gets protected at the fairgrounds. Nashville Electric Service is currently trimming and cutting down trees across the city as part of a new tree trimming policy. The goal is to prevent damage to power lines from fallen trees, like what happened during Winter Storm Fern earlier this year. But many residents say the new policy is too aggressive. WPLN's Seth Thorpe found a Nashville homeowner who's protesting at a high level.
Tandy Solomon spent Thursday at the top of a red maple tree at her Nashville home.
This tree probably was planted in 1987.
Solomon says she hasn't climbed a tree in more than 20 years, but she scaled it several times this day in protest of a new tree trimming policy of Nashville Electric Service.
We are taking a stand against is lack of transparency in this massive shift and the evisceration of trees as a consequence.
The shift she refers to is that NES has increased how much it trims trees back from power lines. It used to be 10 feet, Now it's 15 feet. That's what NES planned for Solomon's red maple, or she could opt to have the entire tree cut down and replaced with a crepe myrtle bush. So that's why Solomon staged a treetop sit-in and posted protest signs across her lawn with slogans like, "Poor pruning does not equal good planning."
There are many, many people in the city who are very upset about these extreme changes to the cutback from 10 feet to 15 feet and the whole-scale devastation that we're seeing in our residential streets as a consequence.
Solomon's protest got the attention of groups like Nashville Tree Conservation Corps. Board member Dorian Lauterin dropped by to show support and explained why they're against the NES policy.
They're saying it's based on a study that they did. They will not share this study. They say that they've engaged experienced arborists, that they're doing it the right way. If that's true, we'd like to see this report.
NES has also not responded to WPLN about what data it used to develop the new trimming policy. Meanwhile, Solomon's protests seem to have worked. Late in the day, an arborist from NES came to say her tree is spared. The reason? It's home to some Baltimore Orioles, and Solomon was told NES to not cut down a tree that birds inhabit. Seth Thorpe, WPLN News.
There's a piece of infrastructure in downtown Nashville that's about to go away. And when it does, there may not be any clues left from one chapter in our city's transportation history. WPLN's Tony Gonzalez brings us this story from Curious Nashville.
It was brief, but do you remember when WeGo had a fleet of electric buses giving free rides in downtown? One listener wonders, whatever happened to those? To answer, let's go to the beginning. I was there in 2015 when officials stepped aboard for their first ride. It's quiet on the new bus, almost too quiet.
One went by me and I'm like, you could hear the tires rolling on the ground. That was essentially the discernible sound. So.
And I went on. The buses looked sleek, charged in minutes, super smooth acceleration, 0 emissions. The mayor at the time called them the ultimate. They ran for just 6 years. The city ended those routes, and then the bus maker went bankrupt. Without reliable servicing, our 9 buses became obsolete, similar in other cities. But the charging stations have lingered. It turns out WeGo recently removed one and is about to take out the other. Soon, the last trace of those EV buses will be as invisible as they were quiet. Tony Gonzalez, WPLN News.
You can ask your question and explore our voluminous Curious Nashville back catalog at WPLN.org/curious. The first director of the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government, or TCOG, died on Sunday in Florida. Frank Gibson got his start in journalism in his teens, working as a copy boy for the Tennessean. He later worked for the Armed Forces Radio and was editor of the University of Tennessee campus newspaper. After graduation, Gibson returned to the Tennessean, which fueled his interest in government transparency. He spearheaded legislation pushing for reporters to get faster court hearings if a public official denied their request for public records. Gibson launched the TCOG in 2003 with a team of First Amendment lawyers and other journalists. The group found that government officials regularly denied requests for public records, violating state law. In 2005, he retired from the Tennessean to focus on TCOG and worked with legislators to create tougher transparency laws. Gibson later served as public policy director of the Tennessee Press Association before retiring in 2017. A celebration of life for Frank Gibson will be held in Nashville. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. A key piece of Nashville's Civil War-era history is getting a makeover. The city is working to update Fort Negley with a more accurate presentation of its story, which is complicated. It's a place built by forced black labor for the Union. WPLN's Cynthia Abrams reports the renovation comes at a time when such efforts are being discouraged by the White House.
Along the winding trail at Fort Negley, a group of college students is in the middle of a final exam. But instead of blue books or essays, TSU's Dr. Larotha Williams has brought his students out for a sort of walk and talk.
They didn't have much in material possessions, but what did they bring with them?
Their clothes and stuff.
How they dress. Food.
Their language.
Religion.
Williams is asking his students about the thousands of people, many of them enslaved or formerly enslaved, who built the stone fortress. which sits atop a hill overlooking downtown.
It's different telling a story in a space where the actions actually occurred.
Fort Negley was a Union fort, but was constructed by Black laborers, many of whom were pressed into work. In 1862, roughly 3,000 men, women, and even children were forced to build, amidst harsh working conditions and little provisions. It's a place that's had a major impact. After the war, laborers settled nearby, establishing important Black neighborhoods. While those were later decimated by the interstates, descendants like Gary Burke are carrying on the memories today.
My great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Bailey, was a soldier here in 1865.
Burke is involved in reenactment efforts and visits often.
Walking amongst the ancestors that once dwelled here brings me a sort of peace and a sort of comfort.
His goal is to make sure that the workers are never forgotten.
You know, unless you pay attention as you walk around the trail to the historic panels that give you information, you'll never know what happened here, that this was a Union fort and that you had African Americans who were forced into labor and what indignations they experienced while doing that.
That sometimes invisible history is something Dr. Williams' students, like Zariah Browning, say is uncomfortable.
Knowing that it's just a place that people walk through and they don't know the cultural significance behind it is kind of like hard to process.
Fort Negley has undergone decades of neglect. Scattered across the park are plaques with historical information. Some are sun-bleached and unreadable. Others emphasize the site's history as a Union fort, downplaying its importance in local Black history. That whitewashing, Dr. Williams says, is another reason why Fort Negley is emblematic.
Who determines what we remember and what we forget? And this place is ground zero for that, right? This being a, quote, Yankee fort. In the Confederacy, there's not going to be a lot of glorification of what happens here.
It's also something the city is looking to rectify. This year, Nashville has embarked on a multi-million-dollar expansion as the first phase of a long-awaited master plan. It's updating the educational signage and adding a memorial lawn. Williams has pushed for a more comprehensive history.
And people were talking about putting a Kroger here, then tennis courts, all kind of bad ideas. But we are here, and it's a testament to council people and the mayors and the community who decided to say, okay, this is a place that we are going to protect.
In fact, it comes at a time when the federal government is dissuading similar efforts. In 2025, President Trump issued an executive order directing agencies to remove, quote, divisive race-centered ideology from federal institutions and monuments. Fort Negley isn't directly impacted, but Nashville's Mayor Freddie O'Connell wants to push back on the president's narrative.
There are people trying to legally prevent histories like those of Fort Negley from being included in textbooks or even our discourse. And that is why the Fort Negley story is one worth knowing, especially right now.
And on a recent Friday morning, at the peak of Fort Negley, a group of volunteers are waist deep in a rectangular hole.
The west edge is at 23.
They're excavating a small plot of land. Nearby, city archaeologist Adam Fracchia is showing tourists some of their findings.
So these are actually percussion caps.
Oh, wow. Huh.
So in the Civil War, your musket had to have a cap to ignite the powder, rather than the piece of flint that would...
He says careful digging is a critical way of filling in gaps in historical knowledge.
If we don't preserve these elements, and elements all over the city, then we start to lose people, the picture of people, since a lot of these people weren't written about in the historical records.
What's left behind is often their only record. As Nashville compiles more voices, more artifacts, more understanding, the city is hoping to tell the whole story of Fort Negley. Cynthia Abrams, WPLN News.
We do this roundup of Nashville news every weekday. please consider subscribing on your favorite podcasting app. And thanks so much to all of you who've left 5 stars, a thumbs up, or a review in your app of choice. That little bit of love really does tell the algorithms that more people should hear about us. And of course, everything at WPLN News is listener supported. You can make a donation at WPLN.org. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.